gotta talk to you. I gotta show you something.
And every sacrifice will be worthwhile.
Are you waving a flag at me?
There's something inside of Michael.
Next time I catch you in a place like that again, I'll kill you.
From the fiery depths of the earth comes a prehistoric mastodon of destruction.
You can't suppress ideas, Mr. Killer, just because you don't like them.
Hey guys, Everett Dudgeon 138 here. Just going to be doing my next installment of my Night Owl review series. Today I want to talk about remakes. That seems to be a point of contention with not just the horror and cult community, but also just the cinema community in general. So I kind of wanted to give my 2 cents on it. It's kind of interesting that a lot of people who complain about remakes don't realize that a lot of their favorite films are remakes themselves. I see a lot of horror fans who kind of complain about the Evil Dead remake and the Dawn of the Dead remake, Texas Chainsaw remake, all that stuff. Meanwhile, they're wearing t-shirts of David Cronenberg's The Fly, or even Joe D'Amato's Beyond the Darkness. A lot of people have no idea Beyond the Darkness is a remake, but the original came out in the 60s with Franco Nero, and I believe it, I'm just trying to remember the title, The Third Eye. Yes, The Third Eye. And but not many people know that that's a remake. So it's quite interesting seeing people kind of complain about something that they themselves are kind of doing. I think a lot of it has to do with kind of that emotional connection to the film that is being remade, and I think a lot of it has to do with a generational thing. Like if you grew up on a certain type of film, if that film is being remade, you're going to have more of a resistance to seeing it being remade rather than a film that came from a prior generation, because those films were before your time. Even though that you might not consider them classics, I would argue that they are more classic in a sense because they have there's a longer sense of vintage longevity with them. But I think the issue with remakes mostly has to do with the originals being ignored. Now, I know the argument for remakes is, well, nothing's going to happen to the original. You can still get the original, there's no problem with it. But to a certain point that is true. Not all the time. I think there are certain cases where the original has been it's so far removed from the lexicon of modern cinema going audiences that when you say the title of the movie, you automatically think of the remake. You don't think of the original or ask, oh, which version? Scarface, perfect example. There was talk of a remake of Scarface probably in the past couple of years, and people were up in arms about it. There's, how can you remake Scarface? It's such a classic film. The De Palma Scarface is a remake itself. Even at the end of that film, it says this film is dedicated to Howard Hawks. Howard Hawks directed the original. The original came out in the 30s. And there was even people on some film forums saying, yeah, but it's a totally different movie. No. It's the same story. Same story. The only difference is instead of Colombian, he is Italian. And instead of cocaine, he has beer because it was during Prohibition. So there are, cultural and generational differences, but it's still the same plot. He still has a strange relationship with his sister. There's still the world is yours sign. It's the same story. But many people have no idea that the De Palma film is a remake, or that Cape Fear is a remake. When I say Cape Fear, they immediately think of Robert De Niro. They don't think of Robert Mitchum as Max Cady. They think of Robert De Niro. And I think, and that's okay, but I think the concern I have is that the original will be so ignored that it will kind of go off into obscurity and no longer even be addressed or in the conversation, essentially being forgotten. So this argument that, well, the films are still there, they still exist. Does something still exist if nobody pays attention to it? Like, I obviously it still does, but to what point? Like, to what extent? And that's kind of concerning for me, because I think that kind of opens up things like revisionist history. I think it opens up dangers of theft of ideas. And these are things from the 80s and 90s that occurred that nobody, I mean, because the internet wasn't prevalent back then, a lot of people couldn't do their research, but it's one of those things where even now, misinformation is still being spread about certain things. I was in the grocery store the other week, and there was a magazine there, and it had all the different versions of Batman throughout the years in cinema. And so it had all these different actors there: Christian Bale, Val Kilmer, Michael Keaton, everybody. But it seemed to be missing somebody. And I skim through the magazine, and lo and behold, there it is. And in plain text, it says the first representation of the character in cinema was done by Adam West. That's not true. It was Lewis Wilson back in 1943 with the Batman serial, and nobody knows it. But for whatever reason, whether this writer didn't do their own research or they didn't think anybody would notice or anybody would care, maybe they didn't care. They just wrote Adam West was the first Batman representation on film. But even though that's not true, somebody is going to take that, see that, and consider that gospel. Even though, truth be told, I'm not a huge superhero guy or anything like that, but somebody's going to take that, consider that gospel, they're going to tell somebody else, and then eventually that's going to become the standard. I would even argue that that is the standard way of thinking, that Adam West was the first Batman, even though that's not true. But in all these comic book vlogs and everything like that, that seems to be what everybody thinks. So then part of me is kind of like, so if that's the case, does the Lewis Wilson Batman exist? Does all the effort put into that serial and the costumes and everything like that, did that happen? Did that exist? I mean, and it's kind of scary to think about something like that, where something is so dismissed and ignored that it doesn't even factor into the conversation anymore, and it's just forgotten over time completely, and it's almost like a legacy is being erased in a lot of ways. That's my concern with remakes. The Thing is another example. I don't get me wrong, I love the John Carpenter film. I think it's great. I prefer the Hawks film myself, but that's a perfect example, because I mean, you could argue that the Carpenter version and the Hawks version are two different interpretations of the same source material, but be that as it may, the Carpenter film has had releases by Studio Canal, Scream Factory, Arrow, Universal, and they've had booklets and comic book adaptations, and there's featurettes on the thing, audio commentaries, behind the scenes anecdotes, and concept art and everything like that. The original, The Thing from Another World, it doesn't have any special features on the DVD or the Blu-ray. I think all it has is just the trailer. That's it. How can a film that iconic and that influential just be dismissed with like a bare bones release? I mean, you would think at least an audio commentary by Tom Weaver, or some liner notes or anything with a little bit more backstory of the original. But for whatever reason, that film is just kind of dismissed. And I don't even think in the Arrow booklet, I have to go back and double check, but I don't think there's any mention of it. of The Thing from Another World. So it's kind of like, whoa, like there's really no discussion on it or anything like that. I mean, Carpenter mentions it on a small featurette, like just for a moment or two, but it's, I don't know. So now when somebody says The Thing, they immediately think of the Carpenter film or the prequel to the Carpenter film. Came out in 2000 something, I forgot. This is the problem when films have the same title and they're kind of supposed to be sequels or remakes or things. It gets really confusing. But the original Thing is now no longer even in the conversation. Now it's just, oh, it's the 2000 remake or it's the Carpenter film, and the original Thing is not even in the conversation, and that's scary to think about. Even something like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. I mean, when there's video essays on there, and they're talking about the Abel Ferrara Body Snatchers film, and then the 70s Body Snatchers film with Donald Sutherland. And I think they're talking about a film even after that. There's no mention of the 50s film. So it's like the original is completely ignored, and this is where I think that's where the danger of remakes is, where it really lies. Where now somebody is going to look at a remake as an original piece, and they're not going to do their due diligence, and because they're going to take it at face value that it's an original idea. There was, like I said, a top 10 films thing of Tubi, where there was mention that of the Evil Dead remake, and they said, oh, it's a remake of a classic film. And then they mentioned House of Wax, the one with Paris Hilton, and they didn't mention it was a remake of a classic film. They just said it was they just proposed it as a new film. And it's like, wait a minute, you didn't mention it's a remake, but you mentioned the Evil Dead one's a remake. I don't understand. Like, House of Wax is a remake of a 1950s Vincent Price film, a 3D film, which in turn is also a remake of a 1930s film with Lionel Atwill, Mystery in the Wax Museum, Lionel Atwill and Fay Wray. And it's so, but I don't know whether it's just the presenter isn't doing their research on this or they just don't care. But when something is dismissed like that or not even addressed, it's really disconcerting, because it's like an entire generation of cinema, an entire legacy and actors and everything is completely being, I don't want to say erased, because you can still buy them, but it feels like it's being dismissed to the point of obscurity. And something like the original Thing from Another World should not fall into obscurity. Something like the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers should not fall into obscurity, or the original Scarface or the original Cape Fear or anything like that. For years, the original Scarface, I mean, you could barely find it anywhere. Luckily, Imprint put out a fantastic release of it. But it's, that it just seemed like it took forever to get that film the recognition that it deserves. And that's kind of, I always find that a little bit troubling. I think it's incredibly important to know what films influenced your favorites. So if you are, say for example, I mean, if you kind of put it into music perspectives, if you are really into something like Led Zeppelin, and you want to play music and you want to write songs like Led Zeppelin and everything like that, and be in a band like Led Zeppelin, but you also don't own any Albert King records or Howlin' Wolf records or Link Ray records or Dwayne Eddy, you're not gonna do it, because you're not understanding where that sound that you love had come from, what its origins were, what its roots were, and where all the influences that your influences had. And I think that's incredibly important to do, especially for creative people and just people in general. Because I understand it's kind of fashionable, and this is why I'm not a huge fan of the Marvel cinematic universe or the DC cinematic universe, because it just seems like the original source material, to ignore the origin stories and everything like that. It seems like it's very fashionable to do, and when you do that, you kind of create these like I said, you open it up to revisionism. Like the idea of Batman having a gun. If you talk to people about that now, people are like, "What are you talking about? Batman is totally against guns. That's the whole point." He started with a gun when he first came out in Detective Comics. So it's, but the idea that somebody can be totally confused by the idea of Batman with a gun, obviously, I mean, you can't expect people to be that into it, but when something becomes kind of the status quo or the standard way of thinking, it's good to kind of have that challenged, and it's good to kind of have that alternative way of thinking, and it's good to kind of have that correction, so that way it doesn't end up like it was in the 80s and the 90s, where people could get away with things like this. For example, Alien. As I described in my previous film, that the Terror from Beyond Space was a huge influence on Alien, but an alien stowaway on a spaceship killing off the crew. And and for whatever reason, people they just ignored that. And there's also other films like Planet of the Vampires with the giant skeletons, and Night of the Blood Beast with the man becoming impregnated with the alien offspring. But people, for whatever reason, Ridley Scott and I believe it was Dan O'Bannon said, "Oh, I never saw or read any science fiction before I made Alien." Come on. But when that film was released, that's what people believed, because they didn't have the research, because all these other things were so obscure that it was kind of dismissed. Now, those films, especially The Terror from Beyond Space, it was heavily inspired by A.E. Van Voigt's Black Destroyer novel. But it's like, that's not even mentioned. So now when you get these Alien coffee table books or compendiums on Alien or the Alien franchise, there's no mention of this. There's no mention of Black Destroyer, A.E. Van Voigt, The Terror from Beyond Space, nothing. And it feels like it bothers me, because it feels like somebody's just, and I understand the old saying that all great artists steal, but I think people who say that are the first to kind of lawyer up when their idea gets stolen and when it happens to them. And I just think that it's a really poor excuse. I'm not a huge Tarantino fan in terms of his creative output, but I respect him as a person and as an auteur and as a creative, because he at least admits, I took it from this idea. This shot came from this movie, and he's at least honest about it. He's not trying to put on, I came up with everything. I have no idea who these people are. I came up with everything myself, and it's hard for me to respect. And that's why I'm not a huge fan of the Alien franchise, because of that reason. I've always found it a point of contention with that. I'm just bothered by the dismissal of A.E. Van Voigt and everything like that. Same with Indiana Jones. Like, I love the Indiana Jones original trilogy, but ever since I found out about Secret of the Incas, which I discussed in my previous video, it feels like, I don't know, the idea that Lucas and Spielberg just kind of had this film hidden away in a vault somewhere, and it took years, and just now the film is being put out on physical media. It just comes off as it's a scary thought, because so if Imprint couldn't get the rights to Secret of the Incas, then the elements of that would have deteriorated further, and it would have fallen into more and more obscurity, and eventually the original wouldn't exist. I mean, it's not a complete remake, but the idea of something just being put away in a vault somewhere and just paying it no attention and just putting no effort into it, or if it is released, just bring it no attention or anything like this, just bare bones release, just get it out and put it under the radar. It just seems really, really disingenuous to do something like that. I think it's so crucial to understand where your influences came from. And so I think at the end of the day, there's nothing wrong with remakes. I mean, the Hammer catalog mostly is just remakes of the old Universal films, I mean, there's tons of stuff like that. Roger Corman remade the same film a couple times. Howard Hawks remade his own films twice, I think. But it's so there's nothing wrong with remakes, and I think personally I prefer Chuck Russell's The Blob over the original Blob, but I also prefer the original Fly over the Cronenberg Fly. So I'm not really biased in terms of generation, but I think it's important to kind of at least acknowledge that an original exists and acknowledge and go and see it, because you have to know where you came from in order to know where you're going. And I think cinema is such a great measuring stick in terms of cultural and historical information. So to see something kind of dismissed is really, because it's old or whatnot, it's really disheartening. And I think there's nothing wrong with remakes or taking ideas or anything like that, as long as you give credit where credit's due. And I think that's the best way to leave it. And it's just, as long as you acknowledge something and don't try and continuously acknowledge something, you keep it alive. If you put it away in a vault, if you don't speak about it, if you ignore it, that's when remakes become a major problem. But yeah, let me know your guys' thoughts on remakes, and let me know what other topics you'd like me to cover. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video. Ciao.